When I think of the 1950s, I picture spotless homes, dinner on the table at 6, and perfectly set hair. But what did it actually take to keep up that lifestyle? Well, I followed a 1950s housewife routine to find out. You know, I've been exploring vintage homemaking routines lately. We've done Victoria in the 1930s, and now we're heading to the post-war 1950s. This was a decade of rapid change, new appliances, new expectations, and a new image of what home life should look like. So I wanted to know, what does a 1950s housewife's day actually feel like? So I found this book, which was one my mum actually had, and I found a 1950s routine. So let's dive in and find out. The routine kicks off at 7 a.m. sharp, which compared to some of the earlier routines I've tried feels almost luxurious. If you remember the Victorian routine, that one had me up before sunrise. So the 1950s housewife seems to get a little bit more sleep, which I'm very grateful for. But don't be fooled. The moment that clock hits 7, the pace is on. The very first tasks are to get up, get dressed, and see to the children, and then make all of the beds. There's no easing into the day, there's no scrolling on your phone with a cup of coffee. It is straight to work. Now, I don't have children, but what I do have is a dog and a cat, and they are more than happy to stand in for them. Walks, breakfast, and attention. It's how we tend to start our day anyways, so it isn't too unusual that the dependents in the house get looked after first. That's actually something I've noticed across all of these vintage routines. The day doesn't ever seem to begin with you. It begins with caring for others and setting the house in order. These routines don't tend to mention when you'd fit in things like hygiene, getting dressed, or, things like that. They place much more focus on the house and the rest of the household first. Beds are made and everyone's fed and the house is already looking put together, all before most of us have even rolled out of bed now. It is a fast, efficient start to the day, and it really does set the tone for how the rest of the day is going to go. By 7:45, it is time for breakfast, and unlike a modern morning routine where you might grab a piece of toast on your way out of the door, this is a proper breakfast. Think porridge or bacon and eggs, laid on the table with everyone sitting down together before the day even starts. It is one of those moments that really does show the difference between then and now. In the 1950s, meals weren't just about the food, they were about the structure and rhythm. Breakfast was a family anchor point, the first of several set meal times that shaped the entire day. Then at 8:30 sharp, the routine turns straight back to work, clearing away, washing up, and resetting the kitchen. For me, this is so much easier because I have a dishwasher, but for people in the 1950s, there was no dishwasher. This is all done by hand, the plates, the pans, everything. I think my dishwasher might be the thing I appreciate most about modern kitchens. It really makes such a difference. What is interesting is just how intentional it all feels. The 1950s routine doesn't let the breakfast dishes sit in the sink until you get around to them. The whole point is to deal with it immediately so the house feels orderly before you move on to the next task. It's efficiency, but it's also kind of discipline. Everything has a place, everything has a schedule, there's no loose ends. Which has its pros, but there are probably also some cons in there too. But by the time the breakfast dishes are done and the kitchen is reset, it should be about 9 a.m, which means the real work of the day is about to begin. So the next section of the routine is called Daily Attention, and it is basically a whirlwind tour of the entire house. Bedrooms, bathrooms, halls, stairs, the dining room, the living room, nothing gets left out. And the idea is that every single space in your house gets touched every single day. Now this is the point where it is easy to imagine that glossy, magazine-perfect 1950s home, sparkling surfaces, perfectly fluffed cushions, and not a hair out of place. But the reality for many households was it was just a lot messier than that. Yes, there were some middle-class families that were starting to get labour-saving appliances like washing machines or vacuum cleaners, but not everyone could afford them. Plenty of homes were still making do with older, heavier equipment or just plain elbow grease. And then there is the time factor. The whole idea behind these routines was that managing the home was a full-time job. Most women were expected to not work outside the house once they were married, and their success was judged by how orderly and welcoming their home looked. So while the daily attention routine sounds exhausting for us today, back then it wasn't really seen as optional. It was part of living up to the social expectations of the time. Of course, that does not mean that everyone's home looked like an advert. Kids still made messes, laundry still piled up, and I imagine plenty of women found the routine overwhelming. But what we see in books like the book of good housekeeping, it isn't so much a reflection of real homes. It's an ideal, the version you'd aspire to, even if you never quite managed it. But I do have more thoughts on this that I will share later in the video, because I have far too many thoughts about the romanticised version of vintage life that we tend to think about versus the reality. But back to the daily attention. So what exactly does this mean? So according to the routine, this is what was expected every single morning between 9 and 10 a.m. In the bedrooms, you'd open the windows to air the room, you would make the beds neatly, straighten and dust surfaces, tidy away clothes, shoes or toys. In bathrooms, you'd wipe down basins and taps, you'd rinse out the bath, mop or polish the floor, and make sure that towels were clean and neatly hung. In the living room and dining room, you'd dust furniture and ornaments, sweep, mop or vacuum the floor, fluff cushions and straighten the sofa, tidy away newspapers, ashtrays, toys or books. And then in the hall, stairs and landings, you would sweep or vacuum, shake out any rugs or mats that need it, and do a quick dust on banisters and skirting boards. It's basically a full reset of the entire home before lunch. And every day. It's the kind of tidy you might do if guests were coming over, or if you were doing a whole house reset, but this is done every single day. Now again, I'm sure the reality of the 1950s wasn't always this perfect. Many families were still living in smaller homes left over from pre-war years, or in newer post-war housing that wasn't always well equipped. Vacuum cleaners were advertised as labour-saving marvels, but plenty of people were still hauling rugs outside to beat them clean. And while books like this suggest that this routine is the ideal, the truth is a lot of women were juggling this alongside part-time jobs, childcare and endless laundry. Things just can't have always got done on schedule. But that's kind of what fascinates me about these old routines. They show us not how people lived, but also the expectations they lived under. The daily attention wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about presenting an orderly, respectable home. Because in the 1950s, your home was seen as a reflection of you. So once the daily attention is finished and the clock strikes 10 a.m, we're still only at 10 a.m in the day, and this is when special work begins. This part of the routine is what gives each day of the week its own character, because instead of doing everything all of the time, the bigger jobs were divided up like this. Monday was washing and ironing day, Tuesdays were weekly work in the living room, Wednesday was weekly work in the bedrooms, Thursday was weekly work in the bathrooms, Friday was weekly work in the kitchen, and Saturday was baking day. On paper, this looks like a really neat system. Every space in the house gets a deeper clean once a week, and nothing is forgotten. And then Saturday is a mix of practicality and comfort, with the whole family looking forward to fresh bread, cakes or biscuits. But again, the reality of these jobs was a lot heavier than it looks on a tidy little list. Take Monday's washing and ironing. Today, laundry is a 10-minute job with machines doing the heavy lifting. But in the 1950s, even with the introduction of electric washing machines, not everyone had one. Plenty of households were still using a boiler or twin tubs and then wringing the clothes out by hand and hanging them out to dry. And as for ironing, it wasn't just shirts and dresses, it was sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, tea-cat towels, everything. And that's why it could take an entire day. Now, I've said before on this channel, I actually don't iron anymore. It's a really special occasion if I bring the iron out. With modern fabrics and tumble dryers, it just isn't necessary in the same way that it used to be. So I mentioned weekly work earlier, and the weekly work days for each room were essentially what we'd now call deep cleaning. In the living room, that might mean moving furniture to vacuum underneath, polishing wood surfaces, dusting skirting boards, or washing curtains. Bedrooms got the same treatment, and bathrooms were scrubbed from top to bottom, and kitchens were scoured until every surface shone. And then there's Saturday baking. This wasn't just about treats, it was about making sure the family had bread, cakes or pies for the coming week. Convenience food in supermarkets was just starting to become more available, but home baking was still a cornerstone of family life. So while the routine looked structured and manageable on the page, in practice it meant hours of physical work. The special work wasn't just a little bonus task that you squeezed in, it was the centrepiece of the morning, and on some days would carry on past lunchtime. But at 10:45, this routine does actually allow for a little pause in the day, a coffee break. And honestly, I think this is really important. After nearly 4 hours of cleaning and tidying and tackling whatever special work of the day was, you'd absolutely need that caffeine boost. It's a rare moment in the schedule where rest is officially permitted, which kind of tells you just how intense the mornings really were. But it is only a short break, because by 11 a.m. it is straight back into whatever big task you started at 10. I'm focusing my time today on our hallway and doing some tasks there, which, if you saw last week's video, you saw the full video on this one, and if you haven't seen it, and if you want a satisfying deep clean, then I'd definitely go and check that video out after this one if you haven't seen it. But anyway, the idea is that the whole of the late morning is devoted to completing one focus area. No flitting between jobs, no distractions, just methodical, steady work. And then this continues right up to 12:45, when the morning ends and lunch, which is also another scheduled rest, begins. But not only that, the routine actually suggests getting changed at this point in the day. The idea that you'd wear a practical outfit for heavy morning chores and then change into something cleaner and nicer and maybe a bit more presentable in the afternoon is such a telling detail. It highlights how much the role of a housewife was both practical and performative. You weren't just running the home, you were expected to look the part while doing it. And by this stage in the day, the rest for lunch really feels well earned. The morning has already packed in more housework than many of us squeeze into an entire week, and we're not even done yet. Then after lunch and a brief rest, the afternoon officially begins at 1:45. And this part of the day is less rigidly choreographed than the morning, but it is still structured and purposeful. A 1950s housewife might go for a walk, either for exercise, errands, or just to check on neighbours. And then comes shopping and running errands. Unlike today, where online orders or quick trips are common, a 1950s housewife shopping was deliberate and time-consuming. She might walk to several shops, carry heavy bags home, and carefully plan each purchase to make sure that she's stretching the family budget. I cheated and had my shopping delivered today, so I'm getting it much easier than a 1950s housewife would. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the afternoons also included things like gardening and outdoor chores, particularly if you had a yard or a vegetable patch. And maintaining these spaces is labour intensive. It's digging, planting, weeding and watering, and it was considered just as essential as indoor cleaning. And then, if you have time, the routine also includes things like mending or sewing in the afternoon. This is repairing clothes, darning socks, or finishing any unfinished projects. These are tasks that required focus and skill, and they were considered a crucial part of keeping the household running smoothly. The afternoon is often presented in nostalgic accounts as leisure time, but the reality is that all of that work sounds far more laborious to me. By the time dinner rolled around, a 1950s housewife had already spent nearly 8 hours of work, much of it physically demanding. And this is what the ideal 1950s housewife looked like. Constant movement, precise scheduling, and a relentless expectation to keep everything running perfectly. But it is time for afternoon chores to wind down, and this is where attention shifts to preparing dinner, which is usually around 5 or 5:30. And this wasn't just about cooking any meal, it involved planning a balanced menu, making sure everything was timed, and often doing any last-minute shopping or prep if ingredients ran low. Meals were generally expected to be home-cooked and hot, and visually appealing, even though the day had already been long and tiring. And then that would be ready by 6 p.m. when the family would sit down to dinner. And then, of course, after dinner you'd have to clear away, wash up and tidy the kitchen, which would take you up until about 7:30. And then you finally get to sit down for the day. And the evening was often the only time there could be a brief moment of personal rest or social activity. So you might do things such as reading, sewing, or listening to the radio. But even that was limited. The day rarely ended quietly. You'd still need to plan for the next day, lay out clothes, and make sure everything was in order for the morning routine to begin at 7 a.m. again. And of course, if you've got children, you'd be putting them to bed and making sure everything was ready for them too. So, what have I learned while following this routine? Well, every day was very intentional and structured. There was a clear order to everything, and it felt like it was really important for the house to look good. And thinking about it, that ideal must have been incredibly hard to achieve, especially in countries like the UK, where families were still recovering from the effects of the Second World War. Resources were still scarce, and the country was still trying to rebuild its homes and towns and cities. And a lot of the way we imagine the 1950s housewives lived also comes from propaganda. The posters, the magazine spreads, and pictures that show smiling women in spotless kitchens, all effortlessly managing home and family. It is what forms our image of the 1950s now. And if you add in the dresses, the heels, the perfect hair and makeup, it feels kind of impossible to achieve. But that's something we rarely talk about. Those images were carefully curated. They weren't necessarily representative of real life. After the war, there was a purposeful strategy to try and get women who'd worked during the war to give up those jobs and return to domestic life. This was in part to allow those coming home from war to step into those jobs again, but this also explains a lot of the pictures of happy families and households that filled magazines and newspapers at the time. On top of this is when the explosion of invention when it came to gadgets and labour-saving devices started, and it was in the interest of manufacturers of those products to show women breezing through their housework with a smile on their faces, happy to be in their domestic life. But the reality is that it was hard work and it was constant. There was no pause from cooking, cleaning and childcare. It seems like it would have been relentless. My mum and dad got married in the 50s. They had me a lot later in their life, but they got married at the height of this time. And it's really interesting to try and place my mum as one of those 1950s housewives. In all honesty, I cannot imagine it because she was not this type of wife. She definitely wasn't by the time I came along a few decades later anyway. But she did have the books. She had this exact book, among others. So there must have been some influence, and I can imagine that she perhaps bought into this idealised version of a stay-at-home wife. But that didn't turn into her reality. She worked at various points through her marriage, and she definitely didn't do this amount of cleaning. By the time I arrived, she had already had 5 kids, and I imagine they took up most of her time when they were young. So I can't help but wonder how many of the women ever managed to live up to this ideal, or whether it was impossible. I have to admit, I do like the structure it gave me, but at the same time, I'm not sure this level of cleaning and routine is realistic for a modern life. It's fascinating to experience, but it is a lot to sustain. One thing I am planning on taking away from this is that getting the bulk of the housework done first thing in the morning leaves the rest of the day a lot more free. And that is something I could definitely implement in my life. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this peek into the routine of a 1950s housewife. If you want to look at my other vintage routines, I'll pop a playlist in the description for you. For the next vintage video, I'm planning on jumping ahead to the 1980s to see how things were changing, which could be really interesting because that's when I was born, so we're starting to get to the era of where my memory starts at that point. So if you're interested in that, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that video. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you in the next video.